Hi, welcome to Wetpixel Live. My name is Adam Hanlon. I'm the editor of Wetpixel, and I'd like to thank Einon from Japan. They're a company that produces strobes and underwater optics and other accessories. Please check them out at inon.jp. I'd also like to welcome my regular contributor, Alex Mustard. Hi, Alex.
Hey, Adam. Nice to see you.
Good to see you too. So, we quite often get asked by very accomplished topside land photographers about getting into underwater photography, and they're seeking advice really about how to take their photographic skills and apply them underwater. So I thought I'd ask Alex, what are his top tips for land photographers that want to take their cameras underwater?
Well, don't we don't want the competition. We don't want those talented so and so's coming and showing us up. So no, but actually, I think both of us would strongly say that we're both very encouraging of anyone wanting to get into underwater photography, because the 70% of the world that is covered by sea is the part that is least well known, and every person that goes down there and can take photos is someone else telling those stories that are so important. So yeah, we're always very encouraging that. I think the first thing I would say is you need to be really comfortable in the water before you should start taking a camera down. Now, underwater photography doesn't always have to involve scuba diving, but it often does. So make sure you've got those scuba diving skills to a level that you've got the spare capacity to start doing photography. That doesn't necessarily take ages and ages. Scuba diving is a very easy sport to learn. It is very much like riding a bike. Some people, they pick it up straight away. Some people, it takes a little bit more exposure. But giving yourself time to get through that process is really, really valuable, because a camera can be a big distraction for your safety. It can be a big distraction in terms of how well you're diving, how well you're looking after the environments you're moving in. And you need to be a good diver to be able to take good photos. As we're about to get on to, underwater photography is done very close up. And to maneuver that close to subject matter without damaging it, without spooking it, without stirring up sediment, requires good diving skills. So those will pay you back.
I think there may be a kind of a school of thought or an idea that, I'm going to learn to dive and I'm going to take my camera underwater. Well, probably what you need to do is actually leave the camera for a little while at least, and it will vary from individual to individual, but get those diving skills really dialed in before you start using the camera underwater. And okay, you're a photographer, your goal here is to take pictures underwater, but in actual fact, you need to get the underwater side dialed in before you then get the photography bit sorted out. Yeah, agree.
So a lot of topside photographers also, they come to me because they want to do some underwater photography to expand their portfolio. And that might be swimming pool photography. It's quite often big animal photography in the ocean. I think a lot of people are drawn to want to shoot whales and things like that. And it might also be freshwater photography, ponds, rivers, that sort of thing. And those three areas don't really need any scuba diving. You can do that photography just with breath holding, being in the water. However, being comfortable in the water will massively improve your photography in all three of those. The typical land photographer doesn't need to think about air. You can breathe and you can do all those things. Breathing, and being able to, keep yourself alive is an important part of underwater photography. So, if you are going to do breath hold diving, work on those skills. If you're working in the swimming pool, just be comfortable in that environment. If you are comfortable, it makes the whole thing possible.
I actually went and did a few years ago. I went and did a freediving course, and obviously I'm a diver, so I have a background in diving. In fact, before that, I have a background in spearfishing. But that freediving course, actually, I did it deliberately in order to improve my freediving ability for breath hold diving with photography, and it paid huge dividends. It makes a big difference. So you can seek out training at whatever kind of level you want to aim this at. Absolutely.
Did you do some nice sort of, yoga poses, getting in the zone, all that sort of fun stuff? Anyway, so to get onto the more serious matters, I think there's a few big technical differences between underwater photography and land photography. And one of the classic sayings in underwater photography is underwater photography would be easy if it wasn't for the water. And the way you should react to that as a photographer is to realize that the more water you try and take pictures through, the worse your photos will be. And in underwater photography, the rule is get close, then get closer still. And if you still, if you think you're close enough, you probably aren't. And experienced underwater photographers just know that their pictures just get better and better and better the closer they get to subjects. When I teach underwater photography, I divide a lot of the techniques into distant techniques and close-up techniques. A distant technique is when the subject is further away than you can touch. That's far away in underwater photography terms. So the majority of the time in underwater photography, we are actually within touching distance of our subjects. We just choose not to touch them because we need to be that close to get the sharp, crisp images. That way we get all the color, all the detail, and all the contrast from our flash guns, which rolls me into the next thing,
Well, I was going to
which is, oh, sorry.
before you get on to the next thing, what I was going to mention was the zoom feature that you all use on land is really something that we don't use a great deal in order to get the subject to appear closer to us underwater. We use it as an option for framing images, but we don't use it as an option to decrease the distance from the image, or we actually physically move towards it. That's a really important thing, you know. So whereas you'd often zoom in on land for wildlife, for example, you just crank the lens in. You can't really do that underwater because the water deadens the optical effect. So
yeah, and our friend Martin Edge, a great teacher of underwater photography, he would always tell people, if you are using a zoom lens, always leave it on the widest zoom setting, get as close as you can, and only then ever touch the zoom control. Never use the zoom control until you're as close as you possibly can be to the subject, because you will always get a more impactful underwater picture by being as close as you possibly can. One of the reasons of getting close is the fact that I would say 95% of underwater photos are taken with flash, and typically underwater photographers typically use 2 flash guns, certainly as they get more experience. And as a result, I think that's a big difference between land photography and underwater photography. Whereas, of course, land photographers use flash, but it's maybe for certain niche types of shots within their genre. Whereas underwater photography is flash photography all the time, and underwater photographers become very proficient at using their flash guns. And the challenge that we have when using flash guns underwater is we want to be able to light our subjects with our flash guns, because if we don't, they will just be a monochromatic blue, because water absorbs color as you go down underwater. So as soon as you're at any depth, the pictures become very monochromatic, and we use flash really to restore that color. But we have to be very careful about how we aim it, because water also has bits in it. And if we shoot through too much water and we light through that same water, our picture is covered in spots, which we underwater photographers call backscatter, which ruins your picture. The best way to remove backscatter from your pictures is not with some clever strobe positioning, although that is important, is to be as close as possible to your subject, because then you're shooting through the smallest volume of water, and as you reduce that volume, you massively reduce the amount of particles in your pictures. Also, going back to point number 1, being good in the water stops you stirring up more particles. So all these things sort of build into each other, and when you get on top of those 3 basic things of diving well, getting close, and lighting properly with flash, suddenly your pictures jump on.
Yep. So obviously the burning issue here is I've got a really good land camera. I can go and I can take wonderful pictures on land. What do I need to do to this camera to take it under? What do I need to add to it to make it work underwater, then, Alex?
So there's a couple of lessons I would say there. The first is that in underwater photography, the underwater accessories, the lenses specific to underwater photography, and the lighting, the flash guns, the underwater strobes specific to underwater photography are far more important to making a good underwater camera than the camera. And every single person spends far too much money on the camera and then has to skimp on the accessories. And in fact, it's the accessories that make a good underwater system. The other thing I would say about that is that ask yourself the question, do you want to risk taking your expensive camera underwater? Now, the advances in housings, and particularly in vacuum systems these days, make floods much rarer, housing floods, much rarer than they once were in underwater photography. However, if you are a serious land photographer who needs your camera all the time, consider, do you want to be taking that specific camera underwater, or do you want to build an underwater system around a cheaper camera that still produces very high quality results, and go down that route, so you're not risking your main camera? And I think that's a question to ask yourself as well. So that would be my comments on those. To take a land camera underwater, you will probably be able to find a housing for most land cameras, but I would actually recommend doing some research, watch some Wetpixel Live, speak to other underwater photographers, and find out what are the popular cameras for underwater photography. Sometimes it's because those cameras, and particularly the lenses and things that they take, are very well suited for underwater photography. But also the popular cameras have far more housing options for them, And because there's more competition between housing manufacturers, those housings tend to be better resolved, because if they're not good, they won't sell. Whereas if you have a weird camera that no one else uses underwater, you might find just one or maybe two housing options. And maybe the housing manufacturers haven't put quite as much effort into those, because there's less competition for sales and less total sales. So they put all their energy. So I would go to the housings, go to the cameras that are popular in underwater photography. There's a reason that they're popular, and also they're better supported. Um, I think the one thing that we've talked about flash, but I think what we haven't talked about is lenses.
Yeah, really
And I
important.
think a very common mistake that new underwater photographers make who come from Topside is they will have some brilliant quality land lenses that they use, and they know that they're super sharp and they're super amazing. And they go, I want to use this lens underwater because it's super sharp, super amazing.
Yep.
The thing that will make your pictures super sharp and super amazing underwater is getting close to your subject. So the lenses that we choose to use underwater are always close focusing lenses, really close focusing lenses. And we either use ultra wide angle ones, typically fisheye lenses, or we use macro ones, close focusing macro lenses. And that's kind of the two options areas in underwater photography. And most serious underwater photographers end up owning several wide angle lenses and several macro lenses. And that pretty much covers nearly all their photography. I think where people often get confused, though, is they think that that when they want to get the best image quality out of their system, they don't appreciate the real challenge in underwater photography, and that is in the optical transition from a camera being inside air to shooting through water. And in a wide angle picture, that's handled by your dome port.
Yeah.
And if you don't spend good money on a good dome port, and you don't have that dome port the right distance from the lens, so set up correctly, and any underwater camera retailer will give you really good advice on this. The underwater camera manufacturers will give you really good advice on this. But if you don't get those things right, you will have the most expensive camera, the most expensive lens. You'll have spent all the money on the housing, and you'll have awful image quality. And someone else who's bought, a $100 extender to get that port at the right length, or spent a couple of $100 to get exactly the right dome port for that lens, will have excellent image quality doing all the same things. So it's really important to appreciate how important getting that optical setup right is if you want to get those really high quality results.
And you've alluded to it already, Alex, but I think it's really important that not all lenses work well behind a dome port. So simply because you've got this wonderful f1.4, f1.8 lens that probably cost a pile of money, doesn't mean that it's going to give you good results behind a dome port. It may not. And the only way you can really find out is by testing it, which is an expensive process. So in many ways, you're better off going back to what you recommended, Alex, going to a retailer, speaking to underwater photographers, and finding out what works, because ultimately there will be a background of experience and experimentation that you can tap into.
And certainly for wide angle shooting underwater, I think the average sort of land photographer sort of doesn't understand why we use fisheyes so much, because they're so distorting. And what people realize very quickly when they start diving is there are no straight lines underwater. You're photographing things that the world is not familiar with. And the advantage of a fisheye hugely outweighs the small disadvantages in distortion, because it's so hard to spot in most underwater pictures, and the ability to shoot the biggest possible scene from as close as possible hugely outweighs that. And that's why we love fisheye lenses. But we do use other wide angles too, which is why I was saying before, you need several wide angles. I think the final piece of advice I wanted to say in this presentation, this talk, was that underwater photography is an unusual and niche discipline in photography. And the more real world advice you can get from people who've got experience at it, the better you will be. And I'd really encourage anyone who wants to get into it to seek help, to go places like the Wetpixel forum, speak to actual weird underwater photographers and find out, what they recommend. Go diving if that's the way you want to get into it, with underwater photographers, attend workshops or go on trips organized by underwater photographers. You will learn so much about everything by osmosis. And if you operate in isolation, you'll continue making mistakes which one or two dives with the right people would just sort out straight away, because you go, that's how you do it. That's how you do it.
That's right.
You understand, how underwater photographers put pictures together, how close they get to subjects, how they manage their lighting, how they manage dealing with the camera on and off boats, things like that. All those little detail stuff, just, you pick it up in a day if you can see someone else doing it.
Yeah.
but it can take a long time to get it all right, learning on your own. So yeah,
Yeah.
seek help, interact with the underwater photography community. They're strange, but they're strangely helpful.
And I mean, in these strange times where possibly travel and everything else is limited, I think you could also learn a great deal by looking at other people's images and trying to figure out how they've done it, and indeed discussing that with other people as well. So if you can get in the position where you're communicating regularly with a community of underwater photographers, which may be on a forum like Wetpixel or somewhere else, and say, I see this picture, how do they do it? And there'll be people around that will be able to figure out how they've done it, and that then allows you to expand your creative sort of repertoire of skills almost virtually. And I think that's a reasonable thing to do at the moment in these strange times. Yeah, wonderful. So lots of good advice there, Alex. And where can people get to see more of your imagery to be inspired and to figure out how you've done it then?
Well, the best place would be in my book, Underwater Photography Masterclass,
Yeah,
which is
absolutely.
full of techniques of underwater photography, and you can look at some pretty pictures at the same time. And that's pretty widely available. So I think even liked by Adam's dog, my book. So
That's the dog seeing off the postman with copies of your book, Alex. So yeah,
okay,
absolutely. So thank you very much, Alex. And I'd like to thank our sponsor again, Einon, for sponsoring this episode. Very much appreciated. We couldn't do it without their support. I'd like to thank you all for watching. Please feel free to add any comments or possibly more questions in the comment section. We'll do our best to answer them, and to drop us a like if you enjoyed it. Thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you again soon.